Hey, Augustine, thanks for your response. I really love talking about consciousness, but it's among the most difficult things to talk about because it's not a thing in the normal sense of, uh, an object which exists in the world, because consciousness is the precondition for there being a world at all, um, which kind of throws you for a loop whenever you try to study it scientifically because science wants to remain objective. It wants to step outside the phenomena that it is observing and measuring. And when it comes to consciousness, you can't do that. It's too personal, it's too intimate, like you said. But let me try to explain what I meant by consciousness not being reducible to the brain. Because I, like you, am not a dualist. I don't conceive of there being some mental substance or thinking substance which exists apart from a material substance. Um, I think that matter is itself endowed with feeling, that matter is inherently experiential, and that you don't get bodies without minds and minds without bodies. Um, the technical term for this, if you want to do some research, is pan-experientialism, and the key word here is experience, because normally when we think of consciousness, we immediately assume we're talking about human beings. Um, Whereas experience is a word which refers to a more primitive kind of awareness, which eventually leads to consciousness given enough material complexity. So we could say that um, even atoms are experiential, but as atoms become molecules, which become um, proteins, which become cells, this awareness deepens, this experience becomes more um, capable of recognizing and giving rise to a world. And once we get to organisms with full-blown nervous systems, we're at this point where we can talk about consciousness. Um, and he talked about consciousness or defined consciousness as basically anything which we experience through our senses, anything that we think. And I would add that science itself is in a way within consciousness. We have knowledge of the world only because we are conscious. Because as I said, consciousness isn't just another thing in the world. It is the very precondition uh, through which we observe a world. And so consciousness exists prior to any scientific reflection. And that's why it's so hard to talk about. And when I say that science hasn't really studied consciousness per se, I just mean that it's certainly done a lot of work studying how um, our conscious experience relates to the brain, like the neuroscientist that you gave as an example, who stimulated different parts of the brain in order to produce this experience in the patient of whatever it was, water being poured on their hand or various memories being recalled just based on an electrode stimulating the surface of the brain. So it's clear that consciousness and the brain are related somehow. But to date, no one has even attempted to give a mechanical or physical explanation for how consciousness could arise from the brain. And so when you say that the hypothesis of a soul or some separate substance, some separate mental substance existing on top of or inside of the brain is meaningless, or that we don't need to suppose that because there's no evidence for it. Well, there's no evidence. There's not even an attempted theory to account for how consciousness could arise from the brain. So either way, we're kind of left having to choose between a materialist or a dualist perspective without a theory to support our assumptions in either case. So, as I said at the beginning of the video, though, I would prefer to see, if not consciousness, then at least experience, which is that more primitive state of awareness underlying consciousness, which is a further complexification of experience. I prefer to see experience as inherent in matter itself, not as a separate substance which exists within matter and can be removed from matter. I don't think that when we die, our physical bodies die, that our soul is then kind of just fully intact outside the body and reincarnates or goes to heaven. I think that somehow, if there is life after death, the death of this body, we, as we being our experience, is transferred to a different body of some kind. Because there always needs to be a physical medium, there needs to be space and time for you to be aware of. So there's no mind without body. That one doesn't make sense without the other, which is why I'm kind of turned off by a strict reductionistic materialism, because it's saying that all that there is matter. And it's true that you won't see anything but matter anywhere in the universe, but that doesn't mean that the matter itself isn't experiential and in some cases conscious. We can't see consciousness because seeing is itself consciousness. And so you can see the weird paradox that arises here. And it's that paradox that I'm trying to point to when I say that consciousness can't be reduced to the brain. So hopefully that's clear. I also wanted to comment on what you said about consciousness being inherently private. I'm not so sure it is. I think that if you really pay attention to your experience, your day-to-day experience among other people, you'll see that if there is a foundation to consciousness, it's really intersubjective. It's not strictly subjective and private, but it exists sort of in this field of relatedness with other subjects, such that our experience of ourselves is, if not dependent, then at least deeply related to the experience of everybody else we share our lives with. And we don't have to assume there's anything spiritual or metaphysical going on that connects us. It could just be as simple as the people we interact with physically on a day-to-day basis are as much in our minds as we are. And again, I'm not a dualist, so I don't think mind is separate from the physical world. It's the interior aspect of the exterior material surface, not separate from the matter, just a different aspect of the matter. And it's hard to find the words to describe this, but hopefully you can get a feel for where I'm coming from here. And I think from a strictly scientific and empirical basis, there is, as I said, no theory for how consciousness could just suddenly emerge from the brain. There's no reason also to believe that there is a soul which exists separate from the brain. But see, rather than choose one or the other, I'm trying to find a middle ground here, and it's not easy to describe exactly what that middle ground is, because words fail when you're trying to describe something that isn't a thing. When you're trying to describe the very precondition of there being anything at all, you kind of run into this difficulty of necessity. So I'll just leave it at that, and let me know if I made any sense. But thanks again for your response, and have a good night.